Hey, how's it going today? Hope everyone's doing well. For today's video, we're going to be talking about taking a black and white thumbnail and developing that into a two-tone sketch with more detail and clarity to it. So the reason we do this is because as fun as doing these basic black and white thumbnails can be, sometimes they don't always communicate what our idea is, and other people can't always understand what's going on. So in order to communicate with other people a little better and for people to understand what our idea is, we have to develop them up into two-tone sketches, a little bit more detail and clarity to them. So when we first start, we're gonna generate a few of these black silhouette thumbnails. These are a lot of fun to do. They don't take a lot of brain power. You can just kind of relax and play around with proportion and shape, try and come up with some ideas. But when you get started with these, the first thing you want to do is have an idea of what it is you're designing. So you don't want to just randomly generate these. You could end up sitting all day generating pages and pages and not actually get anything accomplished. So you want to have at least a rough idea of what it is you're designing. So for this particular video, we're going to be working on a sci-fi witch or a psychic witch of some sort based in a sort of gritty, darker type of world. And we're going to have the witch holding some sort of staff or implement that will be used to channel her magic. So we're going to generate some of these quick little silhouettes. They shouldn't take too long. You know, you kind of just want to focus on the general shape and see if any cool ideas or interesting shapes come out as you're sketching. So focus on quickness and interesting shapes for this particular segment. So part of the reason we do these quick little silhouette thumbnails is not only to find an interesting idea and shapes that we like, but it also helps us to eliminate shapes that we don't like. So as you go through, you might try a few things that you think are interesting or cool, but then you might also try some stuff that you think is not quite fitting the idea you want. So it quickly allows you to eliminate ideas that you thought might be interesting, but as you draw it, you realize, oh, that's not really what you were looking for. And you can move on and not have to worry about spending, several hours or even a whole day working on something that turns out not to be what you wanted in the first place. So another good reason to start out doing these little silhouette thumbnails. Another great thing about Photoshop here is you can copy paste and just duplicate thumbnails you already have and just keep drawing over the top of those ones. So one of the advantages of Photoshop is it has a lot of extra tools that traditional media doesn't have, that just allows you to go a little faster or generate ideas at a slightly greater speed. Nothing magical or special about it, it's just an efficiency and time thing. But you can do this with pen and paper too, but usually I try and go as quickly as possible just to save a little time. So here I duplicated an idea I already had, and I'm just trying out a few other things on top of that idea to see if maybe I can make it more interesting or take it in a slightly different direction, add a little bit of tentacles and creepiness to it just to see if it gives a different feel to the design. So here on this one, you can see I'm trying something a little different than the other ones just to see if it comes up with an interesting idea or sparks any interesting thoughts about what a sci-fi witch might look like. This one I'm going for a little bit more disheveled and ragged look to it. Alright, so now we have picked out 3 of the thumbnails. Now we're going to turn them to gray so that we can start drawing over the top of them. So at this point we have the shape. Now we need to go in and try and figure out what the interior shapes are going to look like. So we turn them to gray, make sure each one's on its own layer, and then you're going to create a new layer over top of that shape and turn it into a clipping mask, and then just draw slightly darker gray over your gray silhouette. So this is just going to make it really easy to just quickly go in and add gray shapes to give a slightly better idea of what's going on in your design. So here I'm throwing on some shoulder pads and some straps with trinkets attached to them. You see on one leg, put in like a pouch, like an oversized pouch on one side. This should also be relatively quick. You're not trying to make it look super cool or give it any interesting lighting or effects or anything. You're purely just trying to figure out what your interior shapes are going to be and where it's going to be located. So it's kind of just like a mapping phase where you're figuring out what shapes are going where and just getting a better idea of what the overall design is going to look like. So here we're putting in some more straps and trinkets, but in a slightly different pattern. I'm just thinking through, okay, now that we have the shapes, what's the design gonna end up looking like? This is where the thinking really starts to kick in. You know, you still don't have to think too hard, but you definitely have to start making some conscious decisions about the direction your design's gonna go in. So once you get your internal shapes drawn in here, you have a couple of different options for the next step you're gonna take. So you can either continue doing this, which is just drawing shadow shapes in and adding detail and cleaning it up, and you just keep working the sketch you have until you have a little bit more detail, and you just keep refining it. That usually works if you have a pretty good idea of what your design is going to look like and you already have a pretty structured image in your head that you're just kind of relaying onto the page. However, if you're still kind of searching, or you're still not quite sure what your details are going to look like, and you don't have a clear image of the final in your head that you're putting down, another option would be to take your thumbnail or your sketch that you have, and you're going to lighten it again so it's even lighter, and then you're going to take that and you're going to use it as a rough base and then draw over the top of that again. So it's similar to when you're sketching with lines, where you see sometimes people will put a lot of scribbly lines and then lighten those and then draw cleaner, darker lines over the top of them. It's a similar method, but you're just going to lighten it up, and then you're going to start putting in a more detailed version of what you want, just so you can get a better idea of the details and structure of your design. Because right now it's still real loose, it's real messy, can't really tell exactly what's going on. You're starting to get a better idea, but it's still pretty rough and be pretty difficult for another person to come look at it and know what you want out of the design. So we're going to take another pass over the top of this, and that's where you're really going to have to start doing the thinking and planning out of all the details of your design. Right now there's not really any details, it's pretty loose, so now we're going to have to start thinking things through. So right now we're thinking through that, where's the head going to go, where's it going to be placed, and then once you kind of get the head in, we're just going to work our way down to the shoulder until we kind of got everything figured out. This stage is kind of where it's hard to have a conversation or talk with other people or have a lot of noise going on while doing this part, at least for me, because this is the part that takes the most brain power. The beginning, when you're doing the thumbnails, is pretty laid back, doesn't take a lot of brain power. And then also the end, when you're just cleaning things up and making it look pretty, that doesn't take a lot of brain power either. It's just this middle part is where all the actual designing kind of takes place. As we come through and start mapping things out and thinking through our design, there's a couple of questions I try and keep in mind and ask myself as I'm doing this part. Main ones are, what's the backstory of this character? Kind of like, how did they get to where they're at right now? You know, did they have a hard upbringing? Did they have an easy upbringing? Just kind of a general idea of the backstory of the character, just to give yourself an idea of what they might look like. Because a lot of times as we go through and live our life, this has physical reflections on ourselves. So if you have a rough upbringing, that might be reflected in your face or the way you hold yourself. If you lived in a mansion and had servants taking care of you, you know, this is also going to be reflected in your face. You know, you might not have as many worry lines or stress lines. You might, you know, have softer hands, less calluses, things like that. So there's just things to keep in mind as you're designing, because the way the person lives is going to reflect in their physical appearance. Another question might be, what type of material are these things made out of? You know, is this really nice linen, or is it really messed up and stained leather? These sort of things will give you an idea of what your materials and design's going to look like. You know, if you have really nice linen, that's going to look different than if you have an old faded piece of clothing. You know, do you have metal? Is that metal going to be reflective? These are all things you kind of want to keep in the back of your head as you're designing. When you start to draw things out, they'll have an interesting look to them. You know, you don't want your design to just be one uniform material across the whole thing. You kind of end up with a sort of gray, muddy look to it, that there's not any one interesting thing that kind of pops out. Everything has a uniform feel. Whereas if you have a bunch of different materials on your character, you're gonna have interesting spots for the eye to land on. Another thing you want to keep in mind is, does this person have any key items or trinkets that they carry around. You know, if, for example, this is a witch character, so what sort of things might a witch carry around? Is she going to carry around, you know, pouches full of special materials that she's collected? You know, is she gonna have some sort of item that she uses to focus her magic? Does she have a staff? Does she have a cane? These are all things that you kind of want to think about as you design, and you can add them into the design as you go, so they'll inform kind of interesting key points for the eye to land on. You know, here we have kind of like this big sort of belt that she has around her stomach that's gonna hold all the straps and pouches to her body. So it'll kind of be like the key point that holds everything, so we can draw all of our straps back to it. So we kind of have a little bit of a map that goes from the shoulder, and then down from the shoulder to the waist, and then from the waist down to the hip. And we're going to use the straps and the pouches to kind of guide the eye from one spot to the next spot to the next. So it'll give a little bit of visual interest as you look over the character. So now we just keep drawing and trying to figure out what are all these details going to be, what's going to be attached here. So I'm thinking going to have this big belt in the middle, probably leave it empty for now, but as we refine it, I'll probably put like a design in there at some point. So a lot of this stuff is just kind of marking out spots that details will go later, and kind of giving myself visual notes for what the design's gonna have in it. So like a whole bunch of scribbly lines could be a note to myself that like, oh, this should be a rough texture, or this should be a torn up texture. But right now I'm not trying to put a bunch of little details in that explain what a torn texture looks like. I just want to put something in there real quickly as a note to myself for when I go into the refining stage of something. So that's kind of the whole point of this method, is you're trying to visualize what a design might look like without actually doing all the details for what the design is, and kind of giving myself notes so that later in the process I remember what my thinking was behind something. So like here we have this kind of like container of some sort, and I'm just putting in a little strap so the container's connected to her body in some way. And even though the strap doesn't have a lot of details on it, I know later, like, okay, it'll probably be like a leather strap with a buckle of some sort, and then some leather straps tied around the actual container. So later on, as I refine, I'll be able to remember that's what that was, and add details that makes it read a little bit better. So here we go, and we darken up the shoulder pad so that it's a little bit more eye-catching. This allows your eye to sort of separate that shoulder pad out from the rest of the body. So the body will be a light tone, and then all of the armor and pouches and stuff will be a dark tone, so that you can easily see when you look at it, whether it's on a game or in a painting or whatever, you can easily see right away the separation between the body and the armor or the clothing that goes over the top of it. So it's an important thing to keep in mind when you're doing this. The value separation between things will help guide the eye through your design. So darker things tend to jump out at the eye faster, and then the lighter things are kind of read as a secondary most of the time, unless you have something very dark and very light right next to each other with a high contrast. Then both of those things usually get seen first. So a good idea is to have a lot of dark things around the head, and then have the head be very light in value. That way the eye will see that right away. And we naturally look at faces first anyway. So if you make the face really light with something really dark right next to it, you'll immediately catch the viewer's attention, and they'll look right at the face. So it's just something to keep in mind as you're designing. As we go here, you can kind of see I'm starting to finish up this mapping phase. I've kind of mapped out general ideas that I had, and I'm just kind of finishing things up. And you can see it's still pretty rough. Like, it's not a pretty sketch yet. Everything is just a rough idea. The point of this isn't to have like a super pretty sketch. The point is to kind of visualize an idea that you have, and then get it to the point where you can communicate that idea to another person. This is something that you're not necessarily making a super pretty picture here. It's more of an idea. It's more for communicating a thought you might have in your head and putting it on a paper. So we're just going through and clarifying things a little bit, darkening things in, and I have the general thought that this is going to have a sci-fi witch. It's going to have a main belt, like a nice thick belt around the waist there, and that's kind of going to hold everything together. and then we'll have this staff off to the side, and that's gonna be the main thing that the witch will use to channel whatever power or energy that she uses, get channeled through this staff here. So go in, put some values on top of that, and then we'll pretty much be done with this phase once I finish putting in the values on that staff there. So here we have a little bit of a Photoshop trick that I like to use. It's nothing too fancy, but I have a bunch of pre-drawn faces. They're very simple. There's like a female, male, straightforward view, and then 3/4 view. And I like to use those for when I'm doing this particular design phase, because it kind of saves the trying to draw a super pretty picture part of my brain for later. And I can just take the pre-sketched face, put it down, and then draw a little over the top of it. So off camera I went and grabbed that and sketched over it a little bit, and now you see me adding it into the design here. So it's nothing too fancy, just a bunch of pre-saved basic faces that you can draw over the top of. It just saves time for when you're trying to think. A lot of times when I'm trying to do a lot of thinking, the pretty drawing part of my brain doesn't work quite as well, and vice versa. So here I'm still in the thinking phase, and I don't want to spend a lot of time trying to make a pretty drawing, but at the same time you need to have a face in there that looks decent. So it's not a bad idea to have a bunch of pre-sketched faces that you can add into your design as you're sketching. That's mainly a Photoshop thing that's a little bit trickier to do if you're doing traditional pen and paper. So here we've got the face added in. Now we're just integrating it into the design. You see it's got some wires and stuff coming off of it. I'm just putting in a few finishing touches here. So this will be kind of the final thoughts of the design. So the whole process shouldn't take too long. I mean, from start to finish, I think it took maybe I don't remember, maybe 2 hours, 2.5 hours from the thumbnail phase all the way to the final sketching phase. So the point isn't to sit and come up with the most beautiful drawing you've ever done. It's just to try and visualize the idea and communicate it for other people to understand as well. And so throughout the course of a day you can come up with a whole bunch of these and kind of play with different ideas you might have. And so here we got our sci-fi witch. And the whole point of the witch is to try and combine some sci-fi elements while still giving it the feel that she maybe got some sort of magic or power that she uses that's not necessarily tied into technology and science of the world. We're just adding some finishing details, you know, nothing that's gonna make or break the sketch, but just something that'll add a little bit of refinement to it and hopefully clarify a little bit. So this is just something you can do to help get your ideas out. You should be able to, at this point, be able to show it to someone else and communicate the idea you had in mind, and they should be able to tell whether they like it or not, or if it's going in a good direction. Or if you're just doing it for yourself, you'll be able to look at it maybe in a day or two and decide if this is actually a good idea, or if you like which way it's going, or maybe you don't like it and it's not quite what you had in mind originally when you set out to do it. So you can sit down and take another shot at it. As you do these, remember a couple of questions to keep in mind as you're designing is: what type of world does this person live in? What's their background? And then what sort of materials is their outfit made out of? Or, you know, do they have a leather materials? Do they have shiny materials? Are they dirty? So just a couple of questions to ask yourself as you're designing. But hopefully this video will help make that jump from thumbnail to sketch, and hopefully it gives you some ideas for things to work on in the future. Thank you.